Welcome to Omastruestories. This is the story of Apinokota, the man who sleeps in a casket. Funny, right? Well, let us find out. Enjoy. In the quiet, isolated village of Kengoma, nestled in the heart of Tanzania, Apinokota's name echoed like thunder across the land. Known for his otherworldly abilities, people came from every corner of Africa to seek his help. Some came to gain wealth, others to heal from incurable ailments, and a few to exact revenge on their enemies. His reputation had spread far and wide, yet there was a mystery that surrounded him. Despite his immense wealth and power, no one had ever seen him spend a single night in any of the luxurious houses he owned. His home, an extravagant mansion overlooking the vast landscape, held a dark secret, one that only Apinokota understood. In the center of his massive living room, a large, ornate casket lay. The casket, with its dark wood and polished finish, was the vessel in which Apinokota slept every night, drawing power from the spiritual world. The night air was thick with the stillness of fear whenever Apinokota performed his rituals. The villagers whispered his name with both awe and dread. Apinokota had amassed not only wealth but power far beyond material riches. His connection to the ancestral spirits made him untouchable. His home, standing like a monolith at the edge of the village, was grander than anything most had ever seen. Yet, inside, the atmosphere was chilling. In the center of his lavish living room, there lay a large casket. Every night, Apinokota would lie inside this casket, the dim light of the house casting long shadows over his figure as he rested, not on silk or cotton, but within the cold embrace of wood and spirit. Women throughout the region had heard of his powers, but none dared to come close to him. They spoke in hushed tones about the strange rituals he performed and the ominous casket in his home. Many believed that a dark curse surrounded him, preventing him from living a normal life. And so, Apinokota lived in isolation, feared by many, untouched by companionship. Though Apinokota's name was known far and wide, there was a lingering sense of unease that followed him wherever he went. His power attracted many to his door, but not a single woman dared to remain close. Women from neighboring villages had heard stories, whispers carried on the wind of the man who slept in a casket and communicated with forces far beyond the living. Some claimed they had seen him walking the village at night, his eyes glazed over as if he were not fully in this world. Apinokota did little to quell the fears. He moved through the village in silence, dressed in flowing robes with his staff always in hand. He drove none of the grand cars he owned, instead choosing a humble, beaten-down vehicle whenever he had to leave his home. The villagers could not understand why such a powerful man would choose to live in such a strange way. They spoke of him with reverence but always from a distance. The women, in particular, avoided him. They feared not just the man, but the heavy weight of the spiritual world that surrounded him. Apinokota had approached many with offers of marriage, but they all refused. The darkness that clung to him, that strange life tied to his nightly rituals in the casket, was too much for anyone to bear. Under the pale moonlight, Apinokota stood at a distance, his figure looming in the shadows. His staff, ever present, gleamed faintly as he looked toward the woman standing far away. His eyes, glazed and distant, fixed upon her with an intensity that made her heart race.
"Come into my world, I will make you happy,"
he said, his voice deep and persuasive. His words hung in the air, filled with promise but laced with something darker. He took a step forward, his presence commanding the space between them. The woman recoiled slightly, her eyes wide with hesitation. She could feel the weight of his words, but the fear gnawing at her was too great. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't think I want to be with you." Every night as the village of Kengoma fell into silence, Apinokota prepared for his ritualistic sleep. In the grand yet eerily empty mansion, the casket lay in the center of the living room like an unsettling centerpiece. As the hours crept closer to midnight, Apinokota would enter the room, his staff clutched firmly in his hand, his gaze distant, as if already communicating with unseen forces. The air in the room would shift, growing heavy with an unnatural energy. Before he slept, his maid, who had served him faithfully for 15 years, would enter the room. Dressed in plain garments, she moved slowly, her eyes covered by a black cloth, tied in such a way that she could only faintly see through it. This was the condition under which she worked for Apinokota, never to see him directly, especially during his nightly rituals. She approached the casket carefully, carrying his food in silence. Her movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as she placed the food beside the casket. With the black cloth over her eyes, she never dared to raise her head too high, knowing that to look upon Apinokota at this hour would bring consequences she couldn't even begin to understand. Once the food was placed, she would leave, her footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floor. Apinokota would eat in the casket, his movements slow and ritualistic, as though every bite was part of some greater spiritual act. When the meal was done, he would lie down inside, close the casket over himself, and fall into a deep, unnatural sleep. It was during this sleep that his ancestors visited him, figures from beyond the physical world, who appeared in his dreams to discuss matters of life, death, and power. When Apinokota finally closed his eyes within the casket, it was not a peaceful sleep but rather a passage into another world. The wooden lid of the casket shut, the room would grow colder, as though the warmth of life had been drained from it. The silence that filled the mansion was thick, yet inside the casket, he was far from the world of the living. His spirit left the confines of the room and traveled into a vast, otherworldly realm, a place he called the land of his fathers. In this spectral world, the sky was dim, cast in deep hues of grey and purple, as if twilight had taken permanent hold. Here, the trees were skeletal and barren, and the air hummed with ancient whispers. Apinokota would find himself walking along a narrow path, with shadowy figures lining the way. These were his forefathers, men who had once walked the earth as powerful spiritualists, now guiding Apinokota in his dealings with the living. He would bow before them, acknowledging their presence, before they would begin to speak in low, rumbling voices. Their faces, indistinct yet familiar, would counsel him on matters of power, sacrifice, and the balance of the spiritual forces that kept his life in order. The staff that Apinokota carried during the day would appear here as well, transforming into a living entity, shifting its form as it channeled the voices of the ancestors. In this world, Apinokota was no longer the man people feared, he was a servant to these spirits, following their guidance to maintain his power. The discussions were cryptic, always laden with warnings of what could come if he failed to heed their advice. Each night, he would return from this world, his mind burdened with the weight of the knowledge he received. When Apinokota returned from the world of his forefathers, he awoke with the weight of their cryptic messages heavy on his mind. The dim light in his grand living room slowly flickered back to life, casting long shadows across the room, as if the spirits of his ancestors still lingered in the air. The ritual was not just a part of his life, it was the very foundation of his existence. Without the guidance of his forefathers, his power would diminish, and he knew that the balance between the living and the spiritual world must always be maintained. Once he left his casket, his days were just as ritualistic. People came from far and wide to seek his counsel, arriving at his mansion in hopes of receiving spiritual solutions, wealth, or healing. They would kneel before him, presenting their offerings, their faces filled with reverence and fear. Apinokota listened to their petitions with an air of detachment, for he knew his decisions were guided by forces far greater than himself. His staff, which had transformed in the world of his forefathers, now lay calmly at his side, its power dormant until it was needed again. Despite the wealth and reverence that surrounded him, there was an undeniable loneliness to his life. He rarely ventured out of his mansion, and the silence within its walls was often broken only by the whispers of those who came to him. His power, though vast, had isolated him, leaving him trapped between the world of the living and the dead, unable to fully belong to either. Back in the village where Apinokota was born, his name was spoken in hushed tones. The elders remembered him as a boy, quiet and strange, but none could have imagined the life he would lead. Though people from faraway lands sought him out for his spiritual powers, the villagers were wary. They avoided his mansion, its towering presence looming over the landscape like a dark cloud. It was said that no one in the village dared visit him, not even out of curiosity. The village was small, and rumors spread quickly. Mothers warned their children not to stray too close to Apenokuta's home, and the men of the village kept their distance. There was an unspoken rule: if you valued your life and your soul, you stayed far away from the man who slept in a coffin and communed with spirits. To the villagers, his mansion was a haunted place, one where the boundaries between the living and the dead had become blurred. One day, a woman from a neighboring village, curious about the man she had heard so much about, agreed to meet Apenokuta. She arrived at his mansion, hesitant but intrigued. As she stepped into his grand living room, her eyes fell upon the large wooden casket in the center of the room. Her breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" she asked, her voice shaking. Apenokuta, calm as ever, gestured toward the casket.
"That is where I sleep,"
he replied, his voice as smooth as the air in the room.
"When we get married, you will be sleeping in the same casket as me."
The woman's face paled. Without another word, she turned and left the mansion, her steps quick and deliberate. She never contacted him again, disappearing from his life as quickly as she had entered. The maid, the only person allowed inside Apenokuta's room, knew the strange routine well. Every morning, she approached the casket with her eyes covered by the black cloth. She would knock on the lid exactly 10 times, her knuckles echoing through the still room. After 10 minutes, Apenokuta would stir, opening the casket slowly. Everything in his life followed the rhythm of 10s, 10 knocks, 10 minutes, 10 steps. The routine was strict, and the maid never deviated from it. She worked in silence, never speaking unless spoken to, and every task she performed seemed like part of a greater ritual, one she didn't fully understand. Apenokuta's mansion was unlike any other, and rumors of its mysterious halls had spread far and wide. People from distant places occasionally expressed interest in visiting the house, perhaps hoping to uncover its secrets or witness its grandeur. But nothing was ever simple with Apenokuta. For anyone unrelated to him who wanted to visit, a tour of his mansion was not guaranteed. Apenokuta would always take 10 days to consult his elders, the spirits he met in the strange, otherworldly realm he entered each night when he slept in his casket. During these nightly visits, he would bow before the shadowy figures and ask for their permission. Sometimes, the spirits would agree, allowing the visitor to enter. But on other occasions, they would refuse, their voices low and ominous. When the spirits said no, Apenokuta never went against their word. No one was allowed to set foot in his mansion unless the spirits gave their approval. Apenokuta's bedroom was large and lavish, with a grand bed placed against the wall. The bed, with its finely woven sheets and soft pillows, stood as a symbol of luxury that many would envy. Yet, despite its comfort, the bed remained untouched. Apenokuta never lay on it, not even for a moment. Each night, he would step over the bed, almost as if it didn't exist. His destination was always the same, the large wooden casket at the center of the room. For Apenokuta, the casket was where he belonged, a space where he could connect with the spiritual forces that guided his life. The bed, no matter how grand, had no place in his strange and ritualistic life in his mind. His nightly routine of sleeping in the casket wasn't just a spiritual ritual, it was a practical act of foresight. He believed that by sleeping in his coffin, he was making things easier for his relatives. If death came for him, there would be no struggle to prepare his body for burial. He had already been resting in his final place every night. It's one less burden for them, he would think, convinced that his strange practice was a gift to those who would mourn him. To him, this was just one more way in which he was providing for his family, even in death. Apenokota sat quietly outside his mansion, gripping his staff with calm assurance. He didn't care what the villagers whispered about him or the strange life he led. "I don't care what people say about me," he often thought to himself. Nobody should meddle in other people's lives. For Apenokota, life was simple. He ate well, owned lands and properties all over the region, and helped people in his own way. In his eyes, he was providing a service to those who sought his spiritual guidance. As long as he had his wealth and power, the opinions of others didn't matter. Before his life became entwined with spiritual rituals and nightly consultations with his elders, he had a close friend, someone he had grown up with. This friend, familiar with the simpler version of Apenokota, couldn't quite understand the changes that had taken place. Every now and then, they would meet, and his friend would ask the same question, "What exactly are you doing these days?" Apenokota always responded with vague answers, shifting the topic to something else. He couldn't discuss the nature of his practices, not even with the one person who had been a constant in his life before it all began. The bond between them remained, but the conversations were never as straightforward as they once had been. His friend eventually found out the truth, that he slept in a coffin every night. Unable to handle the unsettling reality, the friend distanced himself, avoiding any contact with Apenokota from then on. Their once strong bond dissolved, leaving behind only silence. His sister had heard the same rumors, but unlike others, she confronted Apenokota directly. She asked him one day. Apenokota's response was blunt. "Is it true? Do you really sleep in a coffin?" The confrontation left her
Yes,
shaken,
it is
and
true,
from that moment,
but
she
it is
decided
none
to
of your
cut ties with
business.
him.
Leave
She
it alone.
refused to visit or speak with him again. His growing wealth and mysterious practices brought confusion and tension within the family, especially among their relatives and extended family members. It was as though the more successful Apenokota became, the more fractured his relationships became. Over time, Apenokota's relatives grew weary of his lifestyle and stopped trying to reach out. His strange habits and growing wealth had alienated him from most of his family. Meanwhile, he lived in vast mansions, some with more than 30 rooms. Despite the size and grandeur of his homes, many of the rooms remained untouched. He would walk through them occasionally, but some rooms he only entered once every 7 or 8 months. To him, these rooms were mere spaces, empty symbols of his wealth that held no true meaning in his daily life. The mansions, though impressive, were as quiet and isolated as Apenokota himself. Whenever Apenokota decided to spend time in one of his other mansions, it was a quiet yet elaborate process. Movers would come during the day, carefully transporting all of his belongings, clothes, personal items, and everything he needed to maintain his lifestyle. Yet, no matter how skilled the movers were, there was one thing they were forbidden to touch: his casket. The coffin was special, tied to forces beyond the physical world. Apenokota knew that only his elders, the spirits he worked for and with, had the power to move it. And so, as the clock struck midnight, the air around his mansion would grow thick with an otherworldly energy. The casket would be lifted and carried, not by human hands, but by the unseen forces that governed his life. It would be transported silently, always under the cover of darkness, to whichever mansion he chose to stay in next. There had always been whispers about the strange happenings around Apenokota's mansion at night. Two young men, driven by curiosity and perhaps a bit of bravado, decided one evening to hide near the mansion and see for themselves who or what moved his casket at midnight. They positioned themselves in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the casket would be lifted. But the next morning, the village awoke to horrifying news. The two men had been found dead, their bodies savagely mauled, as if by some wild animal. The sight was so gruesome that it sent shockwaves through the community. Suspicion quickly fell on Apenokota. He was arrested, but there was nothing to hold him on. Despite the terrible deaths, he had an ironclad alibi. He was over 1,000 kilometers away at the time, and there was no evidence linking him to the scene. The police had no choice but to release him, though the mystery of what happened to the men lingered like a dark cloud over the village. Among the many rumors that circulated about Apinokota, one of the most persistent was that his coffin had healing powers. People came to him with various ailments, physical, mental, or even spiritual, and each time, he would quietly listen. His solution was always the same: he would allow them to sleep in his casket for one night. By morning, those who had entered the casket would emerge healed, free of their afflictions. Yet, no one ever dared to speak of what they experienced during the night. Strangely, none of them could remember anything about the time they spent in the casket. They would wake up healed, but their minds were blank, unable to recall the darkness, the spirits, or whatever had passed while they lay inside. As Apinokota's secret began to unravel, the outside world took notice. News of his unusual lifestyle, particularly the fact that he slept in a coffin every night, spread like wildfire, thanks to the press. People who had once trusted him with business dealings began to view him differently. Some immediately severed ties, not wanting to be associated with the man who lived among spirits and ancient rituals. For them, his mysterious ways were too much to bear. Others, however, continued to do business with him, either out of necessity or because they believed his spiritual practices gave him an edge. But regardless of the split, the revelation had a profound impact on his dealings, casting a long shadow over his once solid reputation. After the news of Apinokota's life spread, he received calls from many women, each wanting to marry him. Among those women was the one who would eventually become his wife. Many showed up eager to be with him, but their enthusiasm quickly faded when Apinokota told them what they should do and what not. One by one, they left, unable to accept the idea of sharing such a life with him. The woman who stayed with Apinokota was unlike any other. She believed in him in ways no one else had before. Martha. Apinokota knew Martha was different from the others. She was the only one who had dared to step inside his world. So, when she ran, he went to find her. The things I saw, the intensity. It
Why did
was
you leave?
too much for me.
It's normal. What
She
you saw
agreed to
is part
follow
of my
him back
world.
to his place for the second
There is
time,
nothing to fear.
ways no one else had before.
So, no need to run.
When she first entered his world, despite the fear that gripped her, she agreed to lie beside him in that casket. The experience was terrifying. She saw things that most people wouldn't dare imagine: spirits, shadows, and figures that haunted her through the night. But instead of running away, she stayed. The next day, Apinokota knew she was ready. He took her to meet the elders, spiritually to the mysterious spirits who governed his life. They watched her with cautious eyes, but in the end, they accepted her. She was now fully a part of Apinokota's world. Over time, she adjusted to the strange occurrences that came with being by Apinokota's side. She even began to feel happier, finding a strange sense of comfort in the life they shared. Apinokota had finally found someone who could accept him for who he was, including the eerie world he belonged to. His elders had given him a special name long ago, Sabutominefent, a name that only those closest to him knew. And now, she was one of the few who knew him by that name. Over time, she adjusted to the strange occurrences that came with being by Apinokota's side. Now, they do everything together, even sharing their meals inside the coffin where they sleep. In Martha's voice trembled as she recalled her first day at Apinokota's house. I thought it would be easy, she began, her eyes distant as if reliving that moment. But the minute I stepped inside his room, something changed. I felt this overwhelming fear, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't understand. It was too much. I couldn't handle it. So, I ran. She remembered fleeing from the house, her heart pounding as she tried to escape the strange energy that seemed to consume her. Now, they do everything together, even sharing their meals inside the coffin where they sleep. The lavish dining table in their grand mansion remains untouched, a mere decoration in their extraordinary life. Even after years of living together, Apenokota and Martha continued to embrace the strange and spiritual life they had built. Every day, Apenokota would perform his rituals, speaking to the spirits and applying the sacred oils to his ring. Martha, now fully immersed in this life, accepted everything with calmness. Their grand mansion remained a place where the boundaries between the living and the spiritual world blurred. Pastors, business people, and seekers of power still came from far and wide, seeking Apenokota's guidance and spiritual intervention. Despite everything, his reputation had grown stronger over the years. Today, Apenokota and Martha continue to live together, practicing what Apenokota believes is the ultimate truth. Their life together is one of mystery, rituals, and devotion to the spiritual forces that govern their world. Though many still fear him, others seek him out for the answers that only he can provide. And so, Apenokota remains a figure both revered and feared, with people continuing to come to him for help and answers. In the end, it is clear that everyone is entitled to their beliefs. Just as Apenokota lives by his truth, others are free to choose what works for them. The story of Apenokota teaches us that everyone is entitled to their beliefs, no matter how unconventional or misunderstood they may be. Apenokota's life was shaped by his deep connection to a spiritual world that others feared or couldn't comprehend, yet he lived according to his truth. Martha's journey shows how acceptance and trust in one's choices can lead to finding peace and fulfillment, even in the most mysterious of circumstances. Ultimately, the story reflects that each person must choose their path in life, and while others may judge or not understand, what matters is living authentically according to one's beliefs. It also reminds us that belief systems, no matter how strange to others, have the power to shape lives and bring a sense of purpose. Everyone's reality is their own to create. Thank you for watching Omas True Stories. Please, subscribe, share, comment and like.